For my wife, Shirley Chisholm, Miss Christopher Press proclaimed the campaign buttons that women and some men proudly wore during the 1972 presidential primary election campaign. Today those buttons are collector's items because they are artifacts of a special time in American history. The term instead of Miss or Mrs. was just coming into use in 1972. It was a term used by and for women who did not feel their name should identify them as being married or not. After all, Mr. could mean a married man or a bachelor. Why shouldn't a woman's title be any different? The early 1970s were the time of the feminist movement, when women demonstrated for rights they did not have. They wanted equal jobs for equal pay. They wanted the same rights as men had. They pushed for an equal rights amendment to the United States Constitution. Today, people feel comfortable using the term Miss. Women work in jobs that were previously denied them and enjoy greater opportunities in many areas. Shirley Chisholm, a black woman, helped to bring those changes about. As a black person, she has suffered much discrimination in her life. She says that she has often suffered more discrimination because she is a woman. Shirley Chisholm did not win the Democratic Party's nomination as its presidential candidate in 1972, but she won enough votes in the primaries to show that a black woman could be considered a serious candidate. She paved the way for Jesse Jackson to run for president and for Geraldine Ferraro to run as the first woman vice presidential candidate from a major political party. Shirley Chisholm was born Shirley Ann St. Hill in Brooklyn, New York in 1924. Her parents, Charles and Ruby St. Hill, were both from the West Indian island of Barbados, and both had immigrated to New York in the early 1920s seeking a better life. They had known each other slightly in Barbados, but were soon married soon after they met in Brooklyn. Shirley was the first of the three daughters. Like many of the other West Indian immigrants, Charles and Ruby St. Hill wanted to own a house and provide a good education for their children, but it was hard to realize their dreams. Charles St. Hill had hoped to get a factory job, but the only work he could find was a baker's helper. Ruby St. Hill was an excellent seamstress, but with 3 little girls to raise, she could not go out to work. She helped out with household expenses by taking and sewing. Little Shirley loved to play with her mother's sewing machine. When her mother tried to put it out of reach, Shirley piled up chairs and climbed up until she could get to it. Shirley was a determined, independent little girl from an early age. By the time she was 3 years old, she was bossing her younger sisters, Odessa, age 2, and the infant Muriel. Years later, her mother told her that when she was 3, she used to go up to the 6 and 7-year-old kids in the neighborhood, punch them, and say, "Listen to me." What Chisholm likes to refer to her mouth was becoming famous even then. Shirley was fortunate to be so independent so young because when she was still 3 years old, she and her sisters were sent to Barbados to be cared for by her grandmother. Charles St. Hill could not support his family on his income as a baker's helper. Ruby St. Hill had to go out to work. It was her idea to take the girls to her mother just for a few years until she and her husband could save enough money to buy a house. Early in 1928, Ruby and her 3 little girls boarded the steamship Vulcania, bound for Barbados. The trip from the U.S. mainland to the West Indian island took 9 days. After they landed, there was another long trip in a dusty bus to the small village where Mrs. Emily Seale lived. Mrs. Seale, a tall, erect woman, was, says Shirley, one of the few persons whose authority I would never dare to defy or even question. Ruby St. Hill stayed with her daughters for 6 months until she was sure they were accustomed to their grandmother and the tiny village. But when it came time for her to leave, the separation was painful for everyone. Shirley and her sisters cried, and for several weeks they asked every day when she was coming back. After a while, though, they adjusted to their new lives in the big extended family that included, in addition to their grandmother, an aunt, an uncle, and 4 other grandchildren whose parents were also trying to make a life for themselves in the United States. Shirley's grandmother was very strict, and Shirley learned to get along with others better and to share more. But she didn't lose her sense of independence or her mouth. Sometimes even her older cousins would give in to her. There were many chores to be done on the farm, and Shirley did her share. She enjoyed the times when everyone gathered around the dinner table and talked, and Sundays when everyone dressed in their best and walked the 2 miles to church together. When she was 4, Shirley enrolled at the village school and was actually the church. 7 classes were conducted in the same large room, separated only by blackboards. The school day was long, from 8 to 4, and the teachers were very strict. Any child who acted up was flogged with a rod, and Shirley came under the rod her share of times. But she looks back on the experience with gratitude. She learned to read and write by the time she was 5. The days passed into months and the months into years, and still Ruby St. Hill did not return for her daughters. In the United States, the Great Depression of the 1930s had caused prices to rise, so the St. Hills could not save as much as they had hoped. Also, Ruby St. Hill had given birth to a 4th daughter, Selma, and had to stop working to care for her. By the end of 1933, Charles and Ruby St. Hill realized they would have to put their dream of owning a house aside and bring their children home. Shirley was nearly 10 years old when her mother returned. She could not stop looking at her or saying the words, "my mother," over and over. Her joy at being reunited with her mother was tempered by the pain of leaving her grandmother, whom she had come to love. She would always be grateful to her grandmother. "Granny gave me strength, dignity, and love," she says. "I didn't need the Black Revolution to teach me that." Shirley had only the dimmest memories of Brooklyn, and the change was hard on her and her sisters, who did not remember the city at all. They could not get used to the sounds of cars and sirens. All the streets looked the same, and they were constantly getting lost. School was the hardest adjustment for Shirley to make. At PS 84, she was put into the 3rd grade with students 2 years younger than she. In Barbados, she would have been in the 6th form, which was equivalent to the 6th grade. The reason she was placed in the 3rd grade was that in Barbados she had not been taught any American history or geography. Shirley was angry and embarrassed to be in the 3rd grade. She was also bored. Because she already knew so much of the subject matter, she started throwing spitballs and flicking rubber bands at her classmates. She became a behavior problem. Luckily, her teacher realized she was acting up because she was bored. On the teacher's advice, the school arranged for Shirley to have a tutor. And in a year and a half, she not only caught up to her grade level, but passed it. Meanwhile, her education was continuing at home. Shirley's father always bought 2 or 3 newspapers a day and loved to talk about what was going on in the country and the world. Shirley adored him and hung onto his every word. He spoke often of politics, of the need for trade unions. He belonged to the Confectionery and Bakers International Union, and of prejudice by whites against blacks. Shirley listened and tried to understand, but she herself had never felt prejudice. The neighborhood was mostly Jewish, but everyone got along. PS 84 was 80% white, and all Shirley's teachers were white, but she did not feel discriminated against. She was a different color from her teachers and most of her fellow students, but she had been raised to feel pretty and bright and capable of success as long as she worked hard for it. Her feelings about racial differences changed when the family moved to a larger apartment in Bedford-Stuyvesant section of Brooklyn. It was an area where about half the residents were black, mostly newly arrived from the South, and the older Jewish residents felt threatened. For the first time, Shirley heard racial slurs. Shirley faced a similarly hostile atmosphere at her new school, PS 28. After she skipped a grade at JHS 78, there were often racial incidents among the students, but Shirley kept out of them. She did not feel any discrimination from her teachers and continued to do well in school. The only discrimination she experienced was because she was a girl. She made higher grades than all the boys in her class, but she knew they considered her just a girl. She was dimly aware of the fact that the great people in history they studied in school were mostly men. In those days, black history and women's history were not part of the curriculum. The only time blacks were mentioned was when slavery was discussed. The only woman they learned about was Betsy Ross. Shirley was lucky that her father was very knowledgeable about black history. He often mentioned the names of important black people of the past. Shirley went to the local library to find books about them and soon became interested in women. One of the heroines was Harriet Tubman, a slave who became the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad. Reading about Harriet Tubman led Shirley to an interest in Susan B. Anthony, a white woman who fought against slavery and whose house in Rochester, New York, served as a station for Harriet Tubman's Underground Railroad. Both Anthony and Tubman often spoke of how women in the United States at that time had much in common with blacks because they could not vote and did not enjoy equal rights with men. Shirley's parents had so much trouble paying rent on the new apartment that finally her mother had to take a job as a maid for a white family in the Flatbush section of Brooklyn. They could not afford a babysitter, so Shirley had to take on the responsibilities of caring for her younger sisters until her parents came home from work. She became a latchkey kid, carrying the apartment keys on a string around her neck. She took her responsibilities very seriously, but her sisters accused her of being a bully and acting like she was mama. Her experience as a latchkey child made Shirley understand the need for daycare for the children of mothers who had to work. Later, she would fight for daycare programs. Shirley graduated from Girls High School in Brooklyn in 1942 and enrolled in Brooklyn College, where she majored in sociology. While still in college, she began to go to local political meetings, but in those days, a black person, especially a black woman, could not hope to run for political office. When she graduated from college, she looked for a job as a teacher and went to work at Mount Calvary Child Care Center in Harlem. She also enrolled in night classes at Columbia University to earn a master's degree in education. Shirley met her future husband, Conrad Chisholm, at Columbia. He was a detective with a private security company. She wasn't ready for marriage yet, but he was willing to wait. They were married in 1949 when Shirley was 25 and moved into a house in Brooklyn. Chisholm continued to go to political meetings, but she was fed up with the Democratic Party and its unwillingness to treat blacks seriously. In 1953, she worked hard for a black candidate who ran for the post of civil judge as an independent. Her candidate won the election. That same year, Chisholm was appointed director of a private nursery school in Brooklyn. 6 years after that, she went to work for the New York City Division of Daycare. And she and Conrad wanted children, but after 2 miscarriages, she decided to devote her life to other people's children. By the early 1960s, the nonviolent civil rights movement in the South was in full force. Chisholm admired Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but she was more interested in what Malcolm X had to say. A minister of the Nation of Islam, a black nationalist group, Malcolm X criticized black attempts at integration and stressed black self-help. Chisholm felt he understood black people who lived in cities. She and her father often discussed him and believed that any movement for dignity in the black community was healthy. Chisholm joined a group of other blacks who were interested in politics to form the Unity Democratic Club in Brooklyn. Soon it was the most powerful Democratic club in the area. In 1964, Chisholm decided to run for the state assembly. The men in the Unity Club made it clear that they felt a woman had no business running for political office, but Chisholm refused to back down. In November, after a long, hard campaign, she won the election. Although she was not the first black New York State Assemblywoman, Bessie Buchanan of Harlem had that distinction. Chisholm was determined to be the most active one. The first bill she introduced that became a law extended unemployment insurance coverage to domestic workers such as maids and cooks. As a member of the Committee on Education, she introduced bills to increase state aid to daycare centers and raise the amount of money spent on each public school pupil. Both these bills were passed. Elected to a second term in the Assembly, Shirley Chisholm introduced the bill of which she was most proud. It created a program called SEEK that found deserving black and Hispanic high school students and gave them state scholarships to college. In 1968, Chisholm decided to run for Congress from a newly congressional district in her home area of Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn. Her campaign slogan was, "Fighting Shirley Chisholm, unbought and unbossed." She won the Democratic primary, and in Brooklyn that usually meant a sure victory in the November election. But this time, the Republican candidate worked hard in the civil rights movement and became nationally known. Farmer directed his campaigns toward the difference in their sexes. Shirley Chisholm was a nice little school teacher who meant well, but the new 12th Congressional District needed a man. Chisholm decided to answer Farmer's tactics by campaigning hard for the women's vote. In the November election, she won more than 2 times the number of votes that Farmer received to become the first black woman in the U.S. House of Representatives. Shirley Chisholm was also one of the few women and one of the few blacks in Congress, but she didn't let that bother her. She went right to work. She was named the Agricultural Committee, but she refused to accept the assignment. She finally managed to get on the Veterans Affairs Committee. It wasn't what she wanted, but as she said, there are a lot more veterans in my district than there are trees. As a new congresswoman, Chisholm knew she could not get any bills passed. So she concentrated on helping the people in her district obtain jobs or help with problems they were having with various government agencies. She spent long hours in her Brooklyn office. At her Washington, D.C. office, she found herself helping out poor people in the District of Columbia. These people had a representative in Congress, Walter Fontury, but since the district was not a state, he had no vote. At the end of her first 2-year term, Chisholm ran again for Congress and won. This time she got the committee assignment she wanted, education and labor. She decided not to try to introduce new laws, but to work with laws that were already in place but were not being used. In this way, she managed to get money for local Brooklyn organizations and to use laws against discrimination to help people find jobs, housing, and welfare. Around 1970, Shirley Chisholm was giving a speech at a college in the South. A white male student asked her why she didn't run for president. Chisholm answered, "You must understand, whatever my ability to handle the job, and regardless of your belief in me, I am black and I am a woman. But the student's question started her thinking, why not? The next presidential election was in 1972. The Republican president, Richard Nixon, would surely run again. Several Democrats, including Senators Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota, George McGovern of South Dakota and Edmund Muskie of Maine planned to seek their party's nomination. Chisholm knew it was a gamble for a black woman to enter the contest against them. But conditions for women in the United States were beginning to change. In the 1970s, women's movement had started, taking their cues from the nonviolent civil rights movement. Women began to demand equal rights and to demonstrate for those rights. For the first time, women, not just a few, were asking, why not a woman president? College students and women's groups urged Chisholm to run. Black women urged her to run. Almost every politician, black or white, urged her not to. So Shirley Chisholm decided to try. On January 25, 1972, she announced her candidacy. I stand before you today as a candidate for the Democratic nomination for the presidency of the United States. I am not the candidate of Black America, although I am black and proud. I am not the candidate for women's movement in this country, although I am a woman, and I am equally proud of that. I am not the candidate of any political bosses or special interests. I am the candidate of the people. Shirley Chisholm was the first black woman ever to run for the presidential nomination of a major party. She was only the second woman ever to run. In 1964, Senator Margaret Chase Smith of Maine had entered 2 primaries for the Republican presidential nomination. Chisholm decided to use her campaign to speak out on behalf of neglected Americans, minorities and women, and also children. She was strongly against the Vietnam War. She was a strong supporter of abortion rights and the rights of homosexuals, of welfare and tax reform. The candidate of a major political party must win a number of primary elections which choose delegates to the party's national convention. Chisholm started her campaign in Florida, where a primary was to be held in February. She did not have much money, and her campaign organization in that state was really a series of existing organizations that had volunteered to help her. Soon the women's groups were complaining that the blacks were trying to take over. Blacks complained that the women were trying to take over. Women portrayed Chisholm as a woman's candidate. Blacks campaigned for her as a black candidate. Chisholm tried to make peace among these groups, but she was also busy making appearances to raise money. Then, too, she was still a congresswoman and had to be in Washington, D.C. much of the time. She won only 4% of the vote in the Florida primary. But she pressed on. In March, April, and May, she campaigned in New Jersey, Massachusetts, California, Michigan, and North Carolina. In each state, her volunteers fought over who she was supposed to represent. Chisholm tried to smooth things out, but she found that the women were especially hard to deal with. Even more than blacks, I think they showed the effects of their past exclusion from the political process, she later said. And unlike blacks, they found it hard to believe that they had a great deal to learn. Although Shirley Chisholm had strong opinions on many issues and was not afraid to express them, some people criticized her for not having a clear platform or a list of things she would do, if elected. They complained that her platform was herself. She answered her critics by saying that she was forced to campaign on the issue of herself because everywhere she went, people questioned her qualifications to be president. They didn't ask the same of her opponents. The others could point to years of experience in the Senate or in the House or as a governor of some state, she explained. What could I point to but years of working my way up through grassroots politics, fighting past barriers every step of the way, partly because I was black, but mostly because I was a woman. I made it within the system in spite of the system, and that was one of the major thrusts of my campaign. It was all those men who'd had years of experience in law and in Congress and as governors who'd gotten us into this mess we're in the first place. Chisholm did her best to shake up the system, and as primary after primary took place, she received enough votes to keep going. While the percentages were small, they showed that her message was getting through to some people. When she won 5% of the vote in California primary, she became entitled to Secret Service protection. She didn't really think she needed it, but it made her feel like a real candidate. She had never expected to win. Her reason for running was to give the neglected groups in America's society a real choice. With the Democratic National Convention a month away, Chisholm had just a small number of delegates, but she planned to stay in the campaign. That by convention time, the black male politicians who had fought her or ignored her during the campaign would support her. But when the convention got underway in Miami in July, she found that the black men had decided to throw their weight behind Senator George McGovern. At the convention, she pleaded with the black delegates to at least support her on the first ballot and not just give her their votes to McGovern. She urged them to make him give them some promises in return for their votes. Shirley Chisholm was officially nominated on Wednesday night, July 12th, by Percy Sutton, black president of the borough of Manhattan in New York City. Her nomination was seconded by Charles Evers, the black mayor of Fayette, Mississippi. He also urged black delegates to vote for her on the first ballot, so the black poor and other people who have been left out for so long will not be in someone's pocket on the first ballot. But George McGovern won on the first ballot, and Shirley Chisholm's long campaign was over. She supported the choice of her party, but she did not intend to do much work for him. In the general election in November, George McGovern lost to the incumbent Republican President Richard Nixon. Chisholm believed that she made a difference. She had been the reason why many blacks had registered to vote for the first time. She had inspired many women to become involved in politics for the first time. She had blazed the trail. If she had not run for president, perhaps Geraldine Ferraro, a congresswoman from Queens, would not have run for vice president of the United States in 1984. Perhaps Jesse Jackson would not have run for president in 1984 and 1988. Chisholm returned to her work as a congresswoman and fought for the same issues she had talked about as a candidate. She worked to save the Office of Economic Opportunity, which had distributed funds to anti-poverty programs for several years, but which the Nixon administration wanted to disband. She worked on behalf of an equal rights amendment to the Constitution that would ensure equal rights for women. She worked especially hard for a minimum wage bill and was delighted when it passed both houses of Congress. But she was terribly disappointed when President Nixon vetoed it. Angry and discouraged, Shirley announced in 1973, July, that she intended to retire from politics. She was tired of fighting for bills that were not passed into law. She knew that a congressperson had to serve for many years before gaining the seniority and power necessary to have laws passed. She didn't feel like waiting, but she was not a quitter. She remained in Congress several more years and in 1976 became the first black and first woman to serve in the House leadership as secretary to the Democratic caucus. Shirley and Conrad Chisholm had grown apart over the years, in some measure because Shirley was so busy and so often away from home. They were divorced in February 1977. The following September, Shirley married Arthur Hardwick, Jr., an architectural whom she had met 13 years earlier when both were in the New York State Assembly. In 1980, Arthur Hardwick was seriously injured in an automobile accident. He spent 10 months in the hospital and recuperated at home for many more months. Chisholm decided that she wanted to spend more time at home with her husband. Shirley Chisholm left Congress in 1982 after serving 7 full terms and after 25 years in politics. She accepted a position at Mount Holyoke College, teaching courses in politics, race, and women. She became chairwoman of the National Politics Caucus of Black Women. She continues to speak out on political issues and advises other women to enter politics, saying, I don't believe there are really going to be real changes in America until women are in decision making positions.